This video is sponsored by Squarespace. More about them in just a moment. The crisis of love derives from the erosion of the other. Love is one of the most mysterious yet interesting phenomena we humans can feel. It is this multifaceted beast that almost defies traditional categorization and analysis, yet at the same time it is often immediately obvious to us when we feel it. And it has become pretty commonplace to see people express interesting and new dissatisfactions with the state of romance in the modern day. Whereas in the past, critiques of love were often based around skewed power dynamics, today I often see people complain about a more general idea that love has become selfish or somehow narcissistic. So, to continue both my series on Byung-Chul Han and my one about love, I thought we could look at his work The Agony of Eros to show what he thinks is wrong with our current way of approaching romance. Get ready to learn how narcissism can destroy love, what consumerism has done to our relationships, and whether the very foundations of selflessness are being threatened. As always, bear in mind that this is just my interpretation of Han and it will not cover everything in his work. Additionally, it's important to note that just because Han is criticizing something about modern approaches to love does not mean that he is suggesting we should return to some past idea about love, or even that love was necessarily better in the past. Someone can critique the present without arguing for a straightforward return to tradition. Yet this is a surprisingly common false dichotomy that many people make when interpreting texts like this. So, let's begin with the very foundation of Han's analysis: the overfocus on the self in love. But first, I want to thank the very kind sponsors for this video, Squarespace. If you're looking to build a website, then you know it can be a real pain. First, you need to choose a domain name, and then you need to build the thing, and there's always this underlying fear that you are messing up and creating something that's not just messy, but actually looks unprofessional. But this is where Squarespace comes into play. They compress all of that complexity into a single platform and use ready-made templates to take all of the stress and headache out of website building. Additionally, they have a feature called Design Intelligence, which uses AI tools to help you make design choices when building the website. Which is very handy if, like me, graphic design and the visual medium more generally is not your strong suit. Head to squarespace.com/unsolicited advice and use the code unsolicited advice to get 10% off your first purchase of a website or a domain name. But anyway, back to the video. 1. The erosion of the other. When I was younger, it became surprisingly common to refer to anyone born after around 1990 as belonging to the me generation. The observation, primarily made by older people, was that anyone around my age was, in some way, noticeably more selfish than those who came before us. In turn, many younger people threw the same accusation back in the face of older people. However, if we believe Byung-Chul Han, it is not so much that any particular generation is innately or irreversibly more selfish, but rather that we are all being subtly incentivized to become more self-centered. Not necessarily more self-loving or arrogant, but rather overly self-concerned. The backdrop to Han's entire philosophy, including his ideas about love, is that we live in an achievement society. That is, the ethos of our age is primarily concerned with notions of individual accomplishment and achievement. Han thinks this is an important development in both our economic approach and our societal values. Whereas Michel Foucault often argued that civilization was structured around the notion of punishment and that this punishment was used to coerce and ensure compliance, Han instead thinks that this job has been outsourced to individual people. That is, rather than having some kind of violent overseer bearing down on us, we are instead encouraged to judge ourselves by our achievements and structure our life around achieving more and being more and more productive. This is ultimately what Han thinks leads to burnout, because rather than our work being merely a duty imposed by the outside, it is now imposed from within, so that we get no reprieve or escape from it. In other words, the achievement society encourages us to burn ourselves out. However, Han thinks that all of this emphasis on individual achievement has potentially quite disastrous effects on love, and specifically eros or romantic love. Han suggests that the fundamental basis of fulfillment in a long-term romantic partnership is the sacrifice and sublimation of oneself to someone else in some capacity. This idea is present in many of our stories and surviving rituals around love. For example, a marriage ceremony is replete with ideas of service and giving oneself and becoming one flesh. This all suggests that these two individuals are not just choosing to be together, but they are in some sense giving up their own individual egos and handing them to one another, and in the process becoming something more like a single unit. This does not mean that every inch of their individuality and autonomy are sacrificed, but at the very least, there is some recognition that you are no longer a lone agent. You have now given yourselves to one another, for better or for worse. We also find this idea in very early metaphors about love, such as the myth told by Aristophanes in Plato's Symposium. Here, he speaks of lovers as two halves of what should be one 8-limbed creature that has been cruelly cleft in twain by the gods. For him, romantic love, properly understood, is the attempt to recreate this original creature as far as we can. We find this giving of oneself in more gentle ways in the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice, where Orpheus risks everything, including his own life, in the slim chance that he might rescue his love. We hear it in the cry of Cathy in Wuthering Heights that Heathcliff is more myself than I. There is a sense that in committed romantic love, our own identity is now linked to a person that is other than us. And it is this aspect of love that Hahn thinks is under threat. The trouble is, the more we imagine ourselves as pure, achieving individuals, totally disconnected from anyone else, the less the notion of contact with otherness will make sense to us. It encourages us to see our lovers as our achievements, rather than full, individual, agential persons in their own right who are not us. It's a sort of flip side of what some psychologists call codependency. The codependent lovers meld with one another to an inappropriate extent, to the point where they cannot fulfill even basic functions while apart. But for Hahn, the achievement society incentivizes the opposite problem. Here, we are encouraged not to sacrifice any part of ourselves to our partners, and as a result, we also cut ourselves off from one of love's most wonderful aspects. That strange feeling of strength and fulfillment that Hahn thinks comes from giving yourself to another person and them giving themselves to you in return, in a bold act of mutual, loving sacrifice. And I do think that this sacrifice, more than almost any other, is deeply terrifying. Hahn even likens it to a form of dying, and yet he thinks the alternative is far worse. For Hahn, this over-concern with the identity and the ego leads towards mental and existential despair. Because, while we may not be physically isolated, we will then suffer from a form of emotional isolation, because we have not fully acknowledged what Hahn calls the other. This other can be a pretty tricky idea to get your head around, but for Hahn it is closely connected to recognizing that another person is just that, a person, whose complexity stretches far beyond the tiny slices of them that we perceive with our senses. In other words, that they are not us, but they are just as complex and agential as us. We might think that we do this already, but for Hahn this seems to not just be a cognitive experience, but an emotional and behavioral one as well. It's a bit difficult to describe this feeling, but occasionally, when reflecting on how each individual person on the planet has a mental world just as complex as mine, feelings just as extreme, and desires just as strong, I suddenly move from simply recognizing this as a straightforward fact to it sinking in and being overwhelmed by this sheer awe. And I think this may be the kind of thing that Hahn means. The total acknowledgement and processing of someone else as a full person, with all of the mystery and strangeness that this entails. It means accepting that we cannot control them or know everything about them, that they defy simplistic categorization and are a multifaceted being, most of whose facets are hidden to us. At its best, I think Hahn views love as infused with this feeling, and this is partly what I take him to mean by the other. And it is easy to see how these ideas about mutual sublimation and the other clash with the achievement society. If almost everything we do is in service to this idea of individual achievement, then this is the natural attitude through which we will approach love. We will go into it thinking, what can we get out of this? Or what achievement is this for me? This is not necessarily in the sense of exploitation. Hahn doesn't think we're monsters, but rather that in prioritizing our own individual achievement above anything else, we gently forget about the other. The concept of love as the dissolution of extreme individuality falls to the back of our minds, and as a result, many of us are condemned to feel alone even when we are in relationships or among loved ones. For Hahn, there is an invisible hand pushing our lovers away, and it finds its origins in this slow erosion of the other. Importantly, Han does not think the solution is just a matter of individually overcoming this erosion, though I'm sure that can help. He thinks that viewing almost everything through this lens of individual achievement can become a deeply entrenched habit, and it's one that is taught to us from almost the moment of our birth. So it's not something that we can just wake up one day and choose not to do anymore. Rather, if there is a solution, it is to be found with other people. Put a pin in this, as we'll definitely be coming back to it later. But next, I want to move on to another nail in Han's crucifixion of our ideas about love: the overemphasis on positivity. If you want to help me make more videos like this, then please consider becoming one of my wonderful backers on Patreon. The link is in the description. 2. Eliminating the negative. A very interesting concept that has got a lot of airtime online is toxic positivity. This term is used in a lot of different ways, but it often refers to someone who just will not acknowledge how bad a situation is. Like Pangloss in Voltaire's classic novel Candide, they shut their eyes to the evils of the world and instead preach that we must remain constantly positive, constantly upbeat, and not pay attention to anything negative or upsetting. This is often associated with a particular corporate culture which seeks to utilize that positivity for increased production. It is harder to work when you're sad. And an awful lot of Han's philosophy deals with patterns like this, where the overfocus on positivity, construed very broadly, becomes destructive or unhelpful. By positivity here, Han does not just mean it in the conventional sense, but also to mean the exaggeration of abilities, the refusal to accept limitations or boundaries, and the growth of the ego. We see this in his other work, The Burnout Society, where he critiques the notion that you can do anything. He thinks that as soon as you tell someone that, then they infer something must be wrong with them if they have not achieved everything they desired to, which is just not necessarily true. Here, an excess of something positive, the notion that you can do something, has looped back into becoming destructive. In such a situation, Han thinks we desperately need to imbibe a little bit of negativity in order to restore balance. If we truly do believe that we can do anything, then we need someone to sit us down and remind us that this is not true and that we have serious limitations that we ought to recognize. Otherwise, we will fall into despair when we inevitably do not have the power of a demigod. This idea of limitations or ignorance or constraint is what Han thinks categorizes the negative. And he is very worried about the over-positivization of love. For instance, Han points out that love is characterized just as much by longing as by something more positive like pleasure. If you've been in love, you'll probably recognize this immediately. Your love is not there and you feel their absence, almost like a hole in the heart. You truly believe that you would do almost anything to see them or be near them right now, and yet you cannot. And this actually physically hurts. It often manifests as a dull ache in the chest, hence our term heartache. This feeling is markedly unpleasant, and yet it is also a very common aspect of love that undeniably exists. For example, it was noticed by Stendhal, who remarked that absence helped stoke the imagination of the lover, and, if applied properly, can strengthen feeling rather than diminishing it. This separation and longing is a negative aspect of love, both in the straightforward sense of not feeling very nice, but also in Han's sense of recognizing limitations and emphasizing the otherness of the lover. We might also notice that in loving someone, we undertake a huge risk. We give them an awful lot of sway over our emotional states, and even the potential to totally and utterly break our heart. And yet, we trust them not to do this. This is another example of negativity in Han's sense. It is both not to do with pleasure, but it also recognizes that something has become out of our control, and, more importantly, that something about ourselves has become out of our control. It emphasizes the role of the other person, that otherness we were talking about in the last section. Han also touches upon the passion that romance and love can bring to a life. The feeling of your will and mind seized by another person because you are just so passionate about them is not necessarily pleasurable and is another clear case of control being taken away from you. Yet this also very often characterizes love, especially in the early stages. The role of sacrifice we discussed in the last section also introduces negativity into our idea of love. In sacrificing, we realize that we cannot have it all, and that a commitment to one person involves a huge allocation of time, energy, and emotion that we then will not be able to use elsewhere. The particular form sacrifice within relationships often takes, that of a duty, reinforces this. It makes it clear that love heavily involves service. It means sometimes placing someone else's needs before your own, trusting that they will do the same for you. Again, this is not a new concept. A lot of stories about love, romantic or otherwise, involve this kind of sacrificial duty. From Romeo putting his own life at risk simply to see Juliet's dead body, to Sonia in Crime and Punishment explicitly sacrificing her own happiness at points for the sake of Raskolnikov's redemption, to the simple fact of swearing off other people to be in a monogamous relationship. We see this notion of sacrifice and commitment almost everywhere. Hahn's point is not that noticing this negativity in love is particularly groundbreaking, but rather he is worried we are slowly de-emphasizing them, and perhaps even beginning to forget them. This may not be disastrous now, but he worries it may become so in future. I notice this sometimes in my own observations. Underneath most of my videos about love, there will be someone saying something like, "Love and lust are not the same thing." Now, this is a truism. Even in the limited domain of romance, love and lust are not identical. You can lust after someone without loving them, and you can love someone without feeling lust for them, and especially without feeling lust for them at that particular moment. We tend to think of love as far more enduring than lust. And pure lust can often turn pretty destructive, both for the luster and anyone they feel that lust for. However, I also think there's just no denying that romantic love often comes with a healthy dollop of lust. Just because the two concepts are technically separable does not mean that they are not very heavily related, and that talking about one will often involve talking about the other. Likewise, mentioning passionate love or longing sometimes seems to spark accusations of codependence or an unhealthy attitude from a lot of people online. Occasionally, the very idea of sacrificing some part of your ego or individuality to another person is decried as pathological. Now, neither myself nor Hahn are suggesting that these negative aspects of love cannot be taken to the extreme and turn relationships into nightmares. But to deny their very existence often flattens Eros into something that no longer resembles the concept as felt by people. Even worse, Hahn thinks that this more flat way of conceptualizing love may translate back into more shallow engagements with our actual lovers. It could potentially make love merely a vessel for our own pleasures. But so what, you might say? Pleasure isn't a bad thing. And that is certainly true. But for Hahn, if we go around merely seeking our own pleasure and love, then we are essentially being narcissistic. He doesn't mean this in the sense that a psychiatrist might use the term, but instead it links back to that erosion of the other we talked about in the last section. That is, if we focus on pleasure, then we essentially reduce everyone we encounter down to the question, to what extent is this person pleasurable for us? And ironically, this very emphasis on pleasure denies us deeper forms of happiness we might get from a reciprocal relationship with another person that we recognize as an agent. It is the equivalent of someone who says they are a hedonist, but who ends up only pursuing short-term thrills, and so ruins their own life in the process. And as we shall see, this sort of ironic paradox will become a theme over the course of the video. One of the neat things about Hahn's philosophy is that it all tends to loop back round and connect to itself. For him, it is this same emphasis on pleasure, achievement, and productivity that prevents us from acknowledging this negativity in a whole range of domains of life. He thinks it starts with economics and the workplace, but then spreads to affect our relationships and, yes, love. After a while, we struggle to conceptualize anything outside of this frame, and the vicious cycle continues. And in that vein, Hahn thinks that this overemphasis on pleasure has in turn led to a kind of dehumanizing attitude when it comes to love. Namely, that we treat other people as a consumable good. 3. Love as product. This may sound strange, but let's stop for a moment and think about the kind of thing we might do if we were shopping for a new computer. This is probably quite a large expense, so we want to get it right. We might draw up a list of the kind of things we want a computer to do for us. We probably want it to have a certain amount of memory or storage, or to be able to run certain programs. Then we search out and find a laptop which meets our specifications, and try to do this with the lowest possible cost on our part. From a consumer end, this is not that unpleasant of a process. We are likely to end up with a laptop we're happy with, and we can make all of the requirements we need in a laptop very explicit in our minds. Above all, it doesn't make sense to ask the laptop what it wants. We are only concerned with our own needs, and that seems quite appropriate for this situation. But Han suggests we have begun to take the same sort of attitude to love. All through his essays, he criticizes what he sees as an economic approach to romance. We make lists of desirable traits in partners and then shop for them as if they were totally interchangeable, probably with the aid of some app. We try to reduce love down into a cost-benefit analysis and a risk management calculation. But Han thinks this attempt to force love into an economic metaphor does not work because, unlike shopping for a laptop, love is not fundamentally rational and is also ideally not totally self-interested. Again, we can point to the sacrifices or even just the general irrationality displayed by lovers. Take Mark Antony, who reportedly ended his own life upon being mistakenly informed of his lover Cleopatra's death. To hear Plutarch tell it, it was not defeat in battle, but rather the belief that his love had died that prompted him to take this drastic action. Tellingly, with the help of a servant named Eros. This behavior is an outburst of passion that simply does not make sense from an economic perspective. If Antony is a reasonable, self-interested agent, he ought to try to stay alive. Or, at the very least, the spur for his death ought to have been the prospect of being carried back to Rome in chains rather than the death of Cleopatra. After all, we know people can recover from such heartbreak, and presumably so did Antony. And yet, he did not act rationally, and we all sort of understand why. His behavior is ultimately not that surprising and not that inexplicable. But we don't have to turn to such great historical examples to illustrate this overall point. I'm sure we've all done some pretty irrational things in either the pursuit of love or as its consequence. People embarrass themselves, drive themselves out of their minds, or commit terrible acts of self-destruction, all under the influence of love. Han even goes so far as to describe love as a kind of madness. We tend to hear about this when it has reached an unhealthy or antisocial extreme, such as lovers who aid one another in covering up murders or other heinous crimes. But Han's overall point is that the actions of a lover are often not rational and are not the result of self-interested, cool-headed decision-making. So viewing love through an economic metaphor is simply inadequate. It does the same thing as the over-positivization of love. It strips it of a whole bunch of its more nuanced and interesting aspects and so limits our understanding of this powerful phenomenon. Han also thinks that this consumeristic approach to love causes it to be made profane. To put it simply, profanation is where something that has been considered meaningful or sacred is stripped of that meaning. So, when I became an atheist, from my perspective, a whole host of things were suddenly profaned in my mind. The Eucharist no longer seemed like the blood and body of Christ, but instead as a simple wine and wafer. On a more societal level, we might say that certain aspects of the natural world have slowly become profane, or to use Max Weber's term, disenchanted. For example, whereas rivers, forests, and mountains often used to be associated with mysterious, agential spirits, they just aren't any longer. They have lost their sacredness and thus are now profane. In itself, this is a totally neutral phenomenon. We might want to desanctify some things, as we did when we dispense with the divine right of kings. But at the same time, Han suggests that this profanation of love also robs it of some of its sense of meaning. By treating love as consumable, we again contribute to this erosion of the whole other person in the matter of love. We inadvertently make them into an object or a product in our minds. But, as we have said, this otherness is one of the very properties that makes love seem so full. It is why loving a person feels so different to loving a thing. The consumerization of love is, to put it bluntly, an undesirable bit of profanation. It is robbing something of meaning without replacing that meaning with anything, and dehumanizing people in the process. And, according to Han, this object-like way of approaching love eventually lowers even romance between real people to the level of merely pornography. Which is, rather frustratingly, a word I'm not allowed to say on YouTube, so I'll just say obscenity instead. Please do bear with me. For Han, obscenity and obscene sexual images are characterized by what he calls a bareness. That is, a total lack of depth, hiddenness, or mystery, and thus, meaning. This can sound a bit abstract, but in some ways it is a very intuitive concept. Ideally, when you look into the eyes of a lover, a million questions are raised. What are they thinking? What do they desire? What are their opinions of me or the world or of love itself? But none of this is present in an obscene film. Everything is on display. By this, Hahn doesn't so much refer to the fact the actors and actresses have no clothes on, but rather to there being no hint at their wider agency. Their purpose is no longer to be minds, but merely to be bodies, to be objects. It is the extreme endpoint of the lowest cost approach to love we mentioned at the beginning of this section. So when Hahn says that a consumerist way of viewing love is the equivalent of an obscene film, that is a provocative statement behind which is a rather sophisticated philosophical point. We can imagine the extent to which we are making our lover and our love sacred as positions along a scale. On one end, there might be treating them like a god or a locus of worship, and most people would say that this is probably undesirable, and at the very least they're likely not to be fond of it, and neither will you. But at the other end, there is the total profanation of the lover. This would be treating them as an object with literally no value in themselves, other than their utility to you, which is basically the same attitude had towards obscene films. Now, when Hahn is suggesting a consumerist approach is obscene, I do not think he is saying that people today view their lovers as consumable objects, as, on the whole, I think that would be a pretty untenable empirical claim. However, I do think he is arguing it is pushing us further in the direction of the profane than is ideal. After all, seeing something as consumable is seeing it as something for us to use. It does place our wishes as higher than the other person's, even if this is only slightly. It too contributes to the erosion of the other. But lastly, I want to take some of what Hahn has said about eros and romance specifically and extend it outwards into other domains of love. Because I think his observations have potentially a far wider application than he gives them here. And I think it would be fascinating to explore them with you. 4. The Agonies of Loves. An observation that I and every other philosophy YouTuber has made hundreds of times is that whereas English only has one word for love, this is not necessarily true of other languages. The classic example of this is ancient Greece, which also had terms for friendly love, philia, and universal spiritual love, agape, along with some others. And while Hahn focuses explicitly on eros in his essays, I do not think that the criticisms he makes are limited to romance, and they can easily branch out and infect these other forms of love as well. For example, in many Buddhist traditions, there are meditation practices that are designed to cultivate agape for humanity at large. This sort of universal love is taught in the Diamond Sutta, where its explicit spiritual nature is explored at length. And at its ideal, this agape is also meant to be very much other-concerned. It is even taught as a way of dissolving and weakening the ego, which is one of the many aims of many Buddhist teachings. But if we take this into account, then Hahn's concerns about the erosion of the other become even more important. I think we can all imagine the kind of person with a self-centered imitation of agape. We may have even encountered them ourselves. This is someone who, consciously or unconsciously, wears their supposed universal love as a badge of honor to lord over others. Rather than act compassionately and so de-emphasize themselves, they simply brag about how compassionate they are. Thus, the potential of the universal love gets squandered, and instead its mere appearance is idolized. This is what Hahn calls exhibition value, where something is valued not in itself, but rather what it can display to others and how it can garner attention for us. From a Buddhist perspective, this would pervert the purpose of agape, which is to slowly lessen the ego, and so be that bit closer to reaching enlightenment, and so mitigate the sufferings of the world. To simplify things massively. And this importance of agape is by no means limited to Buddhist thought. We find it in the Christian idea that we should imitate Christ's unconditional love for all people. The Russian writer Fyodor Dostoevsky used to talk about how if everyone managed to do this, the world could genuinely start to resemble a paradise. But on the other hand, if the other is truly being eroded in the way Hahn suggests, we stray further and further away from this ideal. You don't need to be religious to recognize this or think that it's a bad idea. Very few atheists would argue that universal love is a terrible ideal to strive towards. Thus, Hahn's critique applies just as much to agape as it does to eros. We could make much the same argument for friendship or philia. Aristotle defined an attitude of friendship as wishing the good of the other for the sake of the other. And just looking at this definition, it is immediately clear that an appreciation of otherness is key to this becoming a reality. Again, we can probably notice this in our own lives. The people that we consider true friends and thus emblematic of philia are the kinds of people who are looking out for us in a way that is not just a reflection of their own self-interest, but is, in some sense, genuinely selfless. And when we care for our friends, we hope to do this as well. For Aristotle, this is a huge part of what separates true friendship from merely a friendship of pleasure or a friendship of utility. If we are friends with someone merely because we find personal pleasure in them or because they are useful to achieving some selfish end, then we cut ourselves off from forging a much deeper and ultimately much more fulfilling bond with them. Again, that's a lot of words, but I think it's a pretty intuitive point. If someone is friends with us mostly because they find us pleasurable or useful, then they will leave when we are no longer pleasurable or useful to them. We will be discarded like an old tool. It is only if someone truly wants the best for us and we want the best for them that the friendship can last the trials and tribulations of life and the fact that we will inevitably not always be sources of pleasure or utility. Of course, the paradox here is that in this firm commitment to the well-being of another person, we end up unlocking far more profound forms of happiness than we ever could if we merely prioritize pleasure. It is very similar to Kierkegaard's point that it is only in taking a leap of faith into something beyond our own self-interest and so transcending the aesthetic stage of life that we actually stand a chance at living a fulfilling existence. And here again, we see the threat posed by the erosion of the other and this consumerist, pleasure-focused approach to love. It may prevent us from forging lasting bonds, not just in the romantic sphere, but the platonic one as well. This is arguably a far more serious problem. While Eros is surely very pleasant, to undermine philia is to undermine the very notion of companionship, and this will affect not only romance, but all relationships. It is one thing to be deprived of the connection you might have with a lover, but without philia, it is difficult to forge any kind of connection with another person at all. It would almost guarantee loneliness in any situation. It places us in a glass box, perfectly capable of seeing other people, but unable to make any real contact. And I think this really gets to the potential stakes at play here. It is not that we have now somehow killed human connection, but if Han is right, we are working to seriously undermine its foundations, and this is a monumental act of collective self-destruction. And the trouble is, once this recognition and prioritization of the other is gone, it will arguably be quite difficult to get it back. If there is one thing caring for someone else as a full other requires, it is a form of trust. In order to feel safe enough to sublimate your own self-interest to someone else, to put your very feelings at pretty dire risk, and to commit a huge amount of time and energy and care to this other person, there needs to be an overarching background of trust that they are at least fairly likely to do the same. Otherwise, the whole situation becomes a rather sad Mexican standoff, where both parties struggle to lower their defenses because they just cannot feel confident that the other person will not shoot them and leave them in the dust. At the individual level, this phenomenon was analysed by John Bowlby, who noticed that those who had severe trauma from either relationships or caregivers often found it incredibly difficult to get close to people or trust that they would be loved. Given their experiences, they found it almost impossible to relax into the kind of self-sacrificial, other-focused dynamic that Han thinks is essential to love. And I think perhaps the most apocalyptic aspect of Han's analysis is its potential social implications. It is obviously far from ideal that some people feel unable to trust enough to love others, but the idea that this could become the norm, and not just the norm, but a norm that is totally rational to follow from a self-interested perspective, that is downright terrifying. It puts us in a situation where people are more scared of being hurt than they are willing to care for others. And for Han, avoiding this will require a truly radical shift in the way we think about love. It will mean consciously and continuously fighting against the incentive to see others as a personal achievement or an avenue for our own pleasure. It will mean rejecting these more economic metaphors of love that some now use as a matter of habit. And it will mean all of us taking the brave step to love other people for their own sake, with all the terrifying personal risk and sacrifice that this entails. It is a pretty hefty task, and one we simply cannot accomplish alone. But perhaps, if enough of us try, we will truly begin to transform our concept of love itself, until it too can reach its ultimate potential. But if you want to learn more about Han's overall philosophy and explore some of the concepts we touched upon in this video, then click here to watch my take on one of his most interesting works, The Burnout Society. I hope you enjoyed this video and have a wonderful day.